2 police officers arrested me for reading in a park. 3 months later, I became the judge presiding over their misconduct case. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees at Riverside Park in Burlington, Vermont, where I sat quietly reading my worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The irony of what was about to unfold still haunts me to this day. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life fighting for justice in courtrooms. But on that crisp October afternoon, justice seemed to have forgotten about me entirely. The screech of tires against pavement shattered my concentration. A police cruiser had pulled up sharply to the curb, its presence immediately drawing curious glances from nearby joggers and families. Officers Blake and Thompson emerged, their faces set with what I would later recognize as predetermined judgment. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," Officer Blake called out, his hand already resting on his belt. The weight of his authority hung heavy in the air, suffocating the peaceful afternoon. My heart rate quickened, but years of courtroom experience had taught me to maintain composure. "Of course, officers. Is there a problem?" Thompson's lip curled slightly. "We received reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind explaining what you're doing here?" The absurdity of the question made my stomach clench. "I'm reading a book in a public park," I replied, holding up the novel. "Is that suspicious activity now?" "ID," Blake demanded, completely ignoring my response. His tone carried an edge that sent chills down my spine. As I reached for my wallet, I noticed phones being raised around us. The park visitors had become an impromptu jury, documenting what was rapidly spiraling into a nightmare. "Sarah Mitchell," Thompson read from my license, his voice dripping with unwarranted skepticism. "Attorney at law?" He exchanged a look with Blake that made my blood boil. "Yes, I'm an attorney," I said firmly. "And I know my rights. What exactly am I being accused of?" Blake stepped closer, his shadow falling across my face. "Getting smart with us isn't going to help your situation, Miss Mitchell." "My situation?" I echoed, struggling to keep my voice steady. "My situation is sitting in a public park, breaking no laws. Unless that's a crime now." What happened next would change not just my life, but the entire landscape of justice in our city. Officer Blake grabbed my arm, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into my wrists before I could even process what was happening. "Stop resisting," Thompson shouted, though I hadn't moved a muscle. The absurdity of the situation would have been laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. As they dragged me toward their cruiser, I caught the eye of a young woman whose hands trembled as she recorded everything on her phone. Her face reflected the horror I felt in my soul. "Please," I called out to her, my voice steady despite the chaos. "Make sure this gets seen." The slam of the police car door felt like the closing of a chapter, but little did Officers Blake and Thompson know they had just opened a book they wouldn't be able to close, one where they'd find themselves on the wrong side of the bench. In the suffocating backseat of the police cruiser, I felt the weight of generations of injustice pressing down on my chest. The same system I had dedicated my life to defending was now showing me its ugliest face. But something inside me hardened with resolve. This wouldn't be just another story of abuse of power. This time would be different. As we drove through the streets of Burlington, I made myself a promise. This wouldn't end here. Not this time. Not with me. The booking process stripped away every shred of dignity I had left. Fingerprints, mugshot, personal belongings confiscated. Each step designed to break you down, to remind you that you're no longer in control. Resisting arrest and obstruction of justice, Officer Blake announced with a smirk as he filled out the paperwork. "Enjoy your stay, counselor." The holding cell was a concrete box with flickering fluorescent lights and walls that held stories of countless others who had sat where I now sat. The metal bench felt like ice through my clothes. Time stretched like taffy, each minute an eternity of humiliation and rage. My phone call went to Maya Rodriguez, my law partner and closest friend. Her voice cracked when she heard mine. "Sarah? Oh my God, what happened?" "They arrested me for reading while black," I said, forcing a bitter laugh. "Maya, I need you to contact Judge Anderson and check social media." There were people recording. 6 hours later, I walked out of the station into the cold Vermont night. Maya was waiting, her car running, breath visible in the autumn air. The moment I got in, she pulled me into a fierce hug. "The video's everywhere," she whispered. "It's getting hundreds of thousands of views. People are outraged." I pulled back, wiping tears I hadn't realized were falling. Good. Let them be outraged, because this isn't over. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Officer Blake's smirk, felt the bite of the handcuffs. At 3 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, the viral video playing on repeat. The comments section was a battleground of anger and support. This is what happens every day in America. She's a judge, and they still did this? Those officers need to be fired. My hands shook as I typed, but my mind was clear. I was drafting a civil rights lawsuit that would shake the Burlington Police Department to its core. Every legal precedent, every violation, every moment of that afternoon would be laid bare. The next morning, Maya arrived with coffee and determination. "The chief of police wants to meet," she said. "They're scared." "Good," I replied, not looking up from my laptop. "They should be." But what happened next would turn this case from a local scandal into something none of us could have predicted. 3 weeks after my arrest, as the lawsuit gained momentum and media attention grew, my clerk, Jennifer, rushed into my chambers, her face pale. "Judge Mitchell," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to see this." She handed me a case file, her hand shaking. As I read, the blood drained from my face. Officers Blake and Thompson were scheduled to appear in court next week on an unrelated misconduct case, and I was the assigned judge. The universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. "They can request another judge," Jennifer said quietly. I closed the file, my decision already made. No, they won't, because that would mean admitting why they need one. That night, I sat in my home office staring at the framed photo of my grandmother on my wall. She had been one of the first black female lawyers in Vermont, practicing in an era when the law was even more explicitly stacked against her. Her voice echoed in my memory. "Baby, sometimes justice needs a little push." The video of my arrest had now reached millions of views. News vans lined my street. My phone buzzed constantly with interview requests. But I stayed silent, preparing for something bigger. Maya visited again, concern etched on her face. "Sarah, are you sure about this? Presiding over their case? It's risky." I turned to her, my voice steady. "They didn't know I was a judge when they arrested me. They saw a black woman reading in a park and decided she was a criminal. Now they'll stand in my courtroom, and I'll show them what real justice looks like." The night before the hearing, I received an anonymous email. Attached were dozens of complaints against officers Blake and Thompson spanning the last 5 years. All buried, all involving minorities, all dismissed. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just about my arrest anymore. It was about every person who had ever felt the weight of a system designed to break them. Tomorrow, officers Blake and Thompson would enter my courtroom expecting another slap on the wrist. They had no idea they were about to face a judge who had seen both sides of their justice, and I was ready to show them exactly what that meant. The morning of the hearing, Burlington's courthouse buzzed with tension. News had leaked about who would be presiding, and the gallery was packed. I stood in my chambers, adjusting my judge's robe, my grandmother's photo tucked in my pocket. Maya appeared at my door. "They're here. And Sarah, you need to see this." Through my chamber window, I watched officers Blake and Thompson stride down the corridor, still wearing their uniforms like armor. But something was different. The swagger was gone, replaced by a nervousness I'd never seen in them before. "All rise." The moment I stepped onto the bench, the air left the room. Officer Blake's face drained of color. Thompson's jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitch. Neither could look me in the eye. Their attorney, James Wilson, immediately stood. "Your Honor, given the unique circumstances, we request denied." I cut him off, my voice steady. "Unless you'd like to state for the record exactly what those unique circumstances are, Counselor," Wilson deflated, knowing any explanation would only damage his clients further. "No, Your Honor. The case before me involved excessive force against Marcus Chen, a 19-year-old college student. As the prosecution presented body cam footage, I noticed Blake and Thompson squirming in their seats. The parallels were impossible to ignore. They didn't even let me explain," Marcus testified, his voice shaking. "Officer Blake just grabbed me and—" He paused, fighting tears. "I kept saying I lived there, that it was my own car, but they wouldn't listen." I watched Blake's face as Marcus spoke. Something was cracking in his expression. The same arrogance I'd seen in the park was crumbling under the weight of consequence. During a recess, I overheard Thompson in the hallway. "She can't do this. She has to recuse herself." "She can," his lawyer replied grimly, "and every attempt to stop her will only make you look worse." When court resumed, it was Blake's turn to testify. As he approached the stand, our eyes finally met. Recognition, shame, and fear crossed his face in rapid succession. "Officer Blake," the prosecutor began, "please explain your actions on the night of September 15th. Blake's testimony was a masterclass in unraveling. Every justification, every excuse sounded hollow, even to him. When the prosecutor showed him the pattern of his past complaints, all involving minorities, he physically recoiled. I was just following protocol," he stammered. "Like you did in Riverside Park last month?" the prosecutor asked pointedly. The gallery erupted in whispers. Blake's face reddened. "Objection!" Wilson shouted. "Sustained," I said calmly. "But Officer Blake, you will answer the broader question about your pattern of behavior." What happened next stunned the entire courtroom. Blake's composure crumbled completely. "I'm sorry," he blurted out, his voice cracking. I didn't." He looked directly at me, then at Marcus. "We were wrong. I was wrong." Thompson stared at his partner in disbelief. Their united front was fracturing under the weight of truth. As the day wore on, more evidence emerged. Text messages between the officers joking about their arrests, buried complaints, witness after witness describing similar encounters. But it was the final piece of evidence that silenced the room. A dashcam video from my arrest, showing what happened after they put me in the car. "Another one for the collection," Blake had laughed. "Did you see her face when I grabbed her?" Thompson replied. "Bet she won't be reading in our park again." I maintained my composure, but my hands gripped the bench until my knuckles turned white. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for my reaction. Instead of anger, I felt something else. Determination. This wasn't just about punishment anymore. This was about transformation. As the sun set outside the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the room, I prepared to deliver a ruling that would echo far beyond these walls. But first, I had something to say to Officers Blake and Thompson. What happened next would change not just their lives, but the entire police department forever. I looked at Officers Blake and Thompson, two men who had once held me in handcuffs, now standing before me awaiting judgment. The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation. "Before I deliver my ruling," I began, my voice cutting through the tension, "I want to share something with you. The day you arrested me, I was reading To Kill a Mockingbird, a story about justice, prejudice, and the courage to stand up for what's right. I pulled out the book from beneath my bench, the same copy from that day, now bearing the scuffs from when it fell during my arrest. You didn't just arrest me that day. You arrested every person who has ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. Every person who has ever felt powerless in the face of authority. Every person who has ever had their dignity stripped away by those sworn to protect it." Blake's shoulders slumped. Thompson stared at the floor, the weight of their actions visible in their posture. But this isn't just about punishment. This is about transformation, about breaking cycles that have persisted for far too long. I opened a folder on my bench, revealing my ruling. "Officers Blake and Thompson, I find you guilty of excessive force and abuse of power. You will both be suspended without pay for 6 months. During this time, you will, first, complete an intensive racial bias training program. Not just attend, but lead discussions about your experiences and what you've learned. Second, work with the community you've harmed. You'll spend 20 hours each week at the Burlington Youth Center, mentoring kids and showing them that law enforcement can change. Third, you will participate in a police reform task force I'm establishing, where your experiences will help reshape department policies." The gallery buzzed with whispers. This wasn't the harsh punishment many expected. It was something different, something hopeful. "But most importantly," I continued, "you will each write personal letters of apology, not just to Marcus Chen and myself, but to every person named in those buried complaints. Every single one." I leaned forward, making direct eye contact with both officers. "This is your chance to be part of the solution, to help transform a system that turned you into men you never meant to become." Blake spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. "Your Honor, "We don't deserve this chance." "This isn't about what you deserve," I replied. "It's about what our community deserves. A police force that protects and serves everyone equally." 1 month later, I sat in my chambers reviewing reports. Blake A. and Thompson's letters had begun arriving at their recipients' homes. The youth center reported both officers showing up early, staying late, genuinely engaging with the kids. But the real change came 3 months later. A young black teenager was stopped by police in Riverside Park. Instead of escalating, the officers engaged in conversation. They learned he was studying for his law school admission test. They wished him luck. The teenager later reported that one officer told him, "We learned from Judge Mitchell. We're trying to do better." 6 months after my ruling, I received an invitation to speak at the Police Academy's graduation ceremony. As I stood at the podium looking at the fresh faces of future officers, I saw Blake and Thompson in the back. They were out of uniform there by choice, nodding as I spoke about justice, dignity, and the power of transformation. The Burlington Police Department wasn't perfect. Change never happens overnight. But something had shifted. The number of excessive force complaints dropped dramatically. Community trust began to rebuild, one interaction at a time. My grandmother's photo still sits in my chambers, but now it's joined by another image, a group photo from the youth center showing officers Blake and Thompson surrounded by smiling teenagers, including Marcus Chen's younger brother. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about having the courage to transform pain into progress, fear into hope, and enemies into allies. What happened in that park was wrong, but what grew from it, that was something right. If you believe in the power of transformation, in the possibility that even the deepest wounds can become bridges to understanding, hit that subscribe button. Share your own stories of justice and redemption in the comments below. Because change doesn't just happen in courtrooms, it happens when we choose to be part of the solution. What moment in your life made you believe in the possibility of real change? Let me know in the comments below.